Well, good morning. Today marks the beginning of a 12-week journey now that we'll be taking through the first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus. And before we look at the first passage this morning, what I wanted to do is just really kind of sketch out quickly for you where it is that we're going, maybe answer the question for you, why Exodus? Why there? One reason is, pretty obvious, is the story itself is just amazing and captivating itself. The story of Exodus is really a timeless tale. It's no wonder that Hollywood has made numerous films about this story. But much more than that, if you want to know the bottom line answer of why Exodus, you can know by looking at the front of your bulletin or by looking at the poster on the back wall of this room here. Because what we say there, what we've said our purpose as a church is to see our city and our world renewed by demonstrating and declaring the transforming power of the gospel. Okay, so what we're saying there is that the message of the gospel, which is what God has done for us in Jesus by rescuing us from our slavery to sin, by his death on the cross, that's the whole basis for everything that we say and do as a church. That's it. But if you're familiar with that gospel message, or maybe even if you've been a Christian for a long time, very often we can assume and think of the gospel as a primarily New Testament message. It's a New Testament thing, right? After all, isn't the New Testament, particularly the first four books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, isn't that where we see, Jesus coming to earth, living a perfectly obedient life? He's dying a sacrificial death for the sins of the world on the cross, rising again 3 days later. That's the gospel, right? So isn't all this other stuff around that message, particularly all that Old Testament stuff, isn't that more like prologue and epilogue to the gospel? Well, the simple answer is no. No, it isn't. And a secondary purpose of this whole series is to really have us afterwards see even terms like Old Testament, New Testament, the titles of the books, chapters and verses, all those things more as location devices for finding a passage in the Bible. Because you see, our English Bible, yes, it has 66 different books in it, but the Bible is not telling 66 different stories. It's just telling one story. One story, which is that a loving creator who made the universe and everything in it, and yet that world was distorted and fractured, disabled really, when we rebelled against that God and brought sin into the world. The rest of the story then is just a story of God working in and through human history in order to rescue us. It's a rescue story of epic proportions, all with the goal of God restoring us back to himself, restoring creation back to its original sinless state, and then to dwell among us again, just as he did in the Garden of Eden. That's the one story that the Bible is telling from Genesis 1 all the way to the end of Revelation. One of the clearest places that we see that same gospel message in the Old Testament is in the book of Exodus. So we are still continuing to focus on that same gospel message. In fact, it's been said that Exodus is actually the gospel message told on an epic scale. So, our plan over the next 12 weeks leading up to Easter is to trace that gospel story in looking at it from a perspective that maybe is a little bit different than we're used to. And that in itself can deepen our understanding of something when we look at it in a different way than we're used to. And then, as we get to the very first Passover in Exodus, at the same time as we get to Easter in our calendars, my hope is that we'll be able to celebrate the death and the sacrifice of our greater Passover lamb, Jesus Christ, in a whole new way and with a whole new depth of understanding and significance that maybe we didn't have before, and in a way that is truly life-changing and transforming to us. All right, so that's a big picture of where we're going and sort of a brief-ish answer to the why Exodus question. So, here we go. If you brought your Bible with you or you want to use the Pew Bible in front of you, turn with me to the book of Exodus, chapter 1. If you're using this brown Pew Bible, you'll find this section of the Bible, this section we're looking at on page 40. And when you found that, would you stand together and we'll read the first 7 verses of Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. This is God's word. You may be seated. Let me pray for us now as we dig into this. Living God, we are grateful and humbled as we come to your word. We ask that we would approach it with humble hearts, as those who are open to receive what it is you want to speak to us by your Spirit. Pray that in each thing that we look at this morning, that we would be inspired and captivated, that we would be transformed by what we read and what we hear, and that we would go out from here changed. For you have said that your word is living and active, and that it achieves the purpose for which you sent it. So would you achieve whatever purpose you have in each one of us this morning, I ask. And as I always ask, eternal God, move and govern my tongue now to speak your truth. Amen. Well, it'll probably surprise a lot of you, I'm sure, to hear that there have been numerous times in my life that I've been wrong. Serious. I don't want to blow anybody's mind here. Don't speak to my family. They probably know that. But there's been lots of times that I've been wrong about stuff. There's lots of different areas that happens. One area in particular that I am very often wrong is when it comes to guessing the end of movies, how it's going to work out. I don't know how many times that I've been like, do you know who the killer is? It's that guy. He's going to come in and literally like 20 minutes later, it becomes so obvious that that's not what's happening. And my wife is very generous and kind. She's just like, yep, doesn't say anything. And so now, let's just say I don't share my opinions quite as freely anymore. But I say all that for the simple reason that I think for all of us, we're living life. We look around us at the facts, at the circumstances of what's happening around us. And very often we assume that we too know how things are going to work out. We just follow the facts and the evidence, and we're like, okay, there's probably going to be this. Okay, as kids, for instance, maybe you see mom and dad are looking at travel magazines or looking at airline websites, and we just assume, we know, obviously, mom and dad are planning a trip to Disneyland. We just know that's what's happening, even if it probably isn't. As parents, one of the skills that we learn and grow in over time that helps secure the safety of our kids is by forecasting how a situation is going to work out ahead of time. We see the game starting, and we can see in our mind's eye, okay, I can see that forehead hitting that coffee table. We just cut it off. We're like, nope, we're not playing that game. What? We can see it ahead of time. Or, I mean, even the family dog, right? Even he can read the signs and knows when we're about to make that fateful trip to be spayed or neutered. And he's hiding under the stairs because he assumes he knows what's happening. But one of the big things that we're saying as we look at our passage today is that Jacob and his sons very likely were doing the same thing. As they packed up their stuff and headed down into Egypt to be with Joseph, who verse 5 in our passage tells us was already there in Egypt. And through a whole series of events that we're going to look at in a minute here, we'll see how God has provided for his people and rescued them. This time he rescued them from famine, which would have wiped out the people of Israel and would have ended the promise that God had made to Abraham to turn them into this great nation. And just looking at the facts around them, just looking at what's happening, it's this great event, this new start. It would have been very easy for God's people there to forecast and assume, okay, finally, from now on, it's probably going to go good from here. We're gonna be okay. And the big problem in doing that, then and today for God's people is that when we presume to know how and when God is going to fulfill his promises, the one thing is we very often set ourselves up for terrible disappointment. And we can also end up wrongly accusing God of being unfaithful to his promise simply because he didn't fulfill the promise the way we assumed he was going to. And what we see demonstrated here, as well as all throughout the Bible, is that God is always faithful to his promises. He is. But very often, this is what I've seen, is that God seems much more interested in the process, much more interested in what we learn along the way than he is just about getting us to any particular destination. Now, because we know how this story works out, I mean, maybe you don't, but maybe I would assume a lot of us have heard the story of Exodus. We know how it's going to work out. And so, much like seeing a movie for a second or a third time, or Nathan for the 30th time, we can look at this story now from a perspective that's obviously much clearer and different than Jacob and his sons had. And I think what we're clearly going to see as we look at these opening verses of Exodus today is the faithfulness of God to keep his promises. The faithfulness of God to keep his promises. And yet, we'll see a God who's faithful to keep his promises on his terms. On his terms, not ours. And in order to see how that works out, we're going to look at these first few verses just in two ways this morning. I want to show you here, one, the God who has been faithful, and then the God who will be faithful. Just those two things, the God who has been faithful and the God who will be faithful. All right? So if you closed your Bibles, I invite you to open them up again at the beginning of Exodus, and we'll dig into this together. So let's begin by looking at the God who has been faithful. The God who has been faithful. Now, as I said at the beginning of all this, the Bible is telling one big story, not 66 individual stories. And Moses, who is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, very often referred to as the Pentateuch, he wants to make sure that he does his part to let us know that that's what's happening. We're telling one story. So although you won't see this in most of our English translations, for all of you biblical language people and Hebrew scholars, maybe you already know, the book of Exodus actually begins with the word "and." You won't see it here, but in the original Hebrew, which is what the Old Testament was written in, Exodus begins with the word "and." So this is Moses' not subtle at all way of drawing to our attention to the fact that the punctuation at the end of the book of Genesis is not a period. It's a semicolon. Semicolon. Actually, maybe you didn't know, the semicolon has actually become a very popular tattoo design for people who have survived suicide attempts. Because grammatically speaking, a semicolon replaces a period, which is meant to signify the end of a sentence, and now expresses the author's desire to continue speaking, to continue writing. And for those of us who have been transformed by that message of the gospel, one of the great hopes for us as well is that because of that hope in Jesus, now the end of our lives will no longer be marked by a period, but only a semicolon, as we head on to the next existence of what God has prepared for us for all eternity with him. So if you look at verse 1 of Exodus, look with me there. We should read it as this: "And these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob." All right? So Moses is very much continuing a story that he's been telling all through the book of Genesis. And that's a story which I'm going to try to attempt to summarize in about 2 minutes. Pray for me. Which includes, one of the great narratives coming through Genesis is the creation of a nation of people through one man, Abram. Abram, who is later called Abraham, whose name means exalted father or father of many. And in Genesis 12, God calls this man to leave his home and to go to a place that he's going to show him. And then in Genesis 15, God promises to Abraham and his wife, this old childless man and his wife, that he's going to give him a land of his own to dwell in, and he's going to make him into a nation as numerous as the stars in the sky. Now, God is faithful to give Abraham a son whose name is Isaac. Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. God's favor rests on the younger son, Jacob, who then has the 12 sons mentioned at the beginning in the first 5 verses of our passage here this morning in Exodus. These guys, who if you didn't know, these 12 sons then become the leaders, the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. So, we see here already God is being faithful to keep his promise, and yet we see that he's got his own time and his own way of keeping that promise, doesn't he? I mean, he doesn't turn Abraham into proverbial sea monkeys and just put him in water and then wakes up in the morning, hey, you're a nation of people. No. God is faithfully and purposefully, generation by generation, keeping his promise. And we see then in verse 5, look with me there, when Jacob and his sons go down to Egypt, they are now 70 persons. There's 70 people there. And that's pretty good, right? You started with one old childless guy, and now you've got 70 people. I mean, if you got a family reunion and you're sitting down at a table with 70 people, all come from one grandma and grandma, that's pretty good. And some of you, maybe you have larger families, you're just thinking, 70 people, that's just the kids' table. Well, okay. Still, 70 people coming from one childless guy, that's pretty good. But do you notice how, even in these first few verses, there's almost this whole sense and feeling of anticipation, isn't there? There's a sense that they've averted this great disaster from death and famine. They're packing up and headed down to Egypt to live with Joseph. And there's this whole new place. It's a whole new start. And there's almost a sense which God is saying through Moses, yeah, there's just 70 coming in. But just watch what I'm going to do now. And in the next verses, we see that God indeed is faithful to that promise. In the coming generations after Jacob and his sons, we see the population of Israel just explodes. Look at what Moses says in verse 6 and 7 here. He says, Joseph and all his brothers in that generation died. Now look at verse 7. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly, became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Now, we don't get the same impression or sense of it in our English translations, but the exceedingly numerous in the Hebrew actually has the sense of it of a swarming infestation of people, which is actually a clever bit of foreshadowing if you know how the story of Exodus works out and the plagues that come against Egypt later. And then at the end of these 5 books that Moses has written in Deuteronomy chapter 10, listen to what Moses says to the people then. He says, your forefathers went down into Egypt with 70 in all, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in the sky. It's the exact wording, it's the exact promise that God made generations before to a childless old man is now come to fruition, and God has been faithful to that promise. Now, a big part of that story that we missed, we didn't get to hear about, and which is actually only hinted at in verse 5, that just says, and Joseph was already in Egypt, is answering the question, okay, well, how did Joseph even get there? How was he able to rescue his entire family and bring them there? Okay, great question. Again, another awesome, fascinating story, which we don't have time to deal with in any great detail. But the Twitter version of this is that Joseph was the very favorite son of his father Jacob, and he was the very least favorite brother of all of Jacob's sons. Okay, he was about as popular as Justin Bieber is to ISIS. And one day, rather than just kill him, which actually was their original plan, Joseph's loving brothers decide to sell him off into slavery to a passing group of traders who were headed down to Egypt. And there's all kinds of crazy things that happen to Joseph while he's there, exalted, then put in prison for years. All kinds of terrible and wonderful things happen. And yet all through the time that Joseph is in Egypt, God protects him and provides for him in amazing ways. One of the ways he provides for Joseph is by giving him a supernatural ability to interpret dreams, to interpret the dreams of people. And Pharaoh, the acting Pharaoh at the time, has a dream that no one can interpret, but Joseph can. He tells him, what your dream means is that this entire land is about to have 7 years of famine. And God has told us that in order to avoid this famine, we need to store up food so that we can survive, and actually, effectively, we can plunder the nations around us who don't know this famine is coming and who will come to us for food. Because of this, Joseph is then exalted to one of the highest places in the whole Egyptian kingdom, second only to Pharaoh himself. And one day, as luck would have it, who should happen to wander into Egypt looking for food but Joseph's brothers? Uh-oh. And yet, in one of the most beautiful pictures of forgiveness and grace in all of Scriptures, Joseph forgives his brothers. He sees that all of the wicked actions of his brothers were actually simply God's means of sending him ahead of them into Egypt so that he would now be able to rescue God's people, to bring them down into Egypt, and to put them under his own blessing and protection. It's another beautiful picture, actually, of the gospel, just in this story of Joseph. So already, God's people here, they have countless examples. As we start the book of Exodus now, they have countless examples of his faithfulness to protect his chosen people as well as to multiply them. They've got all these examples. I mean, God has done exactly what he said he would do. Now, no, he hasn't done it in the way that Abram or maybe anyone else would have thought that he was going to do it, but he has been faithful to the promise. And even here, God's people already have more than ample evidence of that. And as we consider all of this that we've just looked at here, this fly-through of Genesis and now into Exodus, I want to challenge you for a moment to think of your own life. To stop for a moment. I pray this is something you do often, but stop for a moment here and now. Take this time to look back at your own life for a minute. Recount instances of God's faithfulness to you. Where has God been faithful to you in your own life? It's a great and thing that we should do often, because I'll tell you what, my own personal experience tells me that it's very easy when we're in the midst of difficulty or trial, especially if that trial or difficulty is extended for a long period of time. It's very easy to forget those instances of God's faithfulness to us in the past, to sink into despair or doubt or even unbelief in a God who has been faithful to us over and over and over again. And looking back, recounting God's faithfulness to us, remembering his goodness and provisions in those moments that seemed equally impossible to us back then, and that can be life-giving water to our dry and parched faith when we do that. Now, this is not just remembering the good old days and trying to feel better as we think about good memories. That's not what we're doing. What I'm talking about is reminding ourselves of likely the exact same emotions and fears that we're having now that we had then, and remembering how God was faithful then to fulfill, to take care of us in those moments, to give us faith and trust that he can do it again. That's what we're doing. If you're a Christian here this morning, we need to remember God's stated goal in his word in saving you is to grow your faith, and it's to make you look more and more like Jesus. That's why he saved you. And if you were at retreat this past weekend, you would have heard our speaker, Bill Clem, say so well. If God's purpose in saving you was just to get you to heaven, he would probably just kill us right after he saved us. Lesson learned, problem solved, I've achieved the purpose. But if God's purpose, as I said, is more, that he's more interested in the process and what we learn along the way, instead of just getting us to a destination, I want you to consider this. Maybe the point is that God is trying to achieve something in the process. And what I'm trying to emphasize right here is simply that as we go about that learning and growing, as we go through that process, remembering the faithfulness of God to us in the past is a powerful tool and weapon for overcoming our present fears and doubts and worries, as well as motivating us to keep going, keep pressing forward as we remember that faithfulness in the past. So think about it. How has God already been faithful to you? And don't think generally either. Think really specifically. How has he been faithful to you? Some of you, if you are type A's, it may help you to even write a list. Keep a list of the ways that God has been faithful to you, some of those things that just came to your mind. Put it somewhere where you're going to see it. Maybe write these things in your journal and reread them often. Such a helpful reminder. Friends and spouses can and should also be helpful reminders in difficult times of how God has been faithful to you in the past, so that you're not tempted to jump off the train in the middle of the tunnel. I've said before, whenever God has carried our family through a difficult situation or time, I always say to my wife, or she'll say to me, hey, don't let me forget this. Next time we're in a situation like this, can you remind me of what we felt here and how God was faithful to carry us through that? Because it's going to happen again, and I'm going to need to be reminded of this. Can you do that for me? We can be that same encouragement to each other, and I believe those lists, those remembrances can help us as well. Okay, so that's the God who has been faithful. Next, I want us to look at the God who will be faithful. The God who will be faithful. And we need to talk about this for two reasons. First of all, because we've only looked at 7 verses of 15 chapters, okay? And most of the 15 chapters, there's going to be lots of opportunity to forget God's faithfulness. There's going to be all kinds of opportunity to doubt and be afraid and be fearful. The second reason is because although God has been faithful to make Abraham into this nation as numerous as the stars, do you remember what else God promised to do? What else did he promise to do? To give them a land of their own. He hasn't done that yet. And that's the second point. It's a big one, because the reality is, just simple geography will show you what God is doing here is actually moving his people out of the land that he promised to give them. He's moving them away from it and taking them down into Egypt. Now that seems backward. That's moving them away from the promise, isn't it? That's like telling someone, hey, I want to hike the Grouse Grind with you tomorrow, and then saying in the morning, I want to meet you out in Richmond. It's just, you're not moving in the same direction anymore. But already, what I'm doing here, I'm giving you an opportunity to practice what we just said. I'm giving you an opportunity to practice and recall and remember God's faithfulness in the past so that we don't slip into despair and doubt right now. God has been faithful to take one childless man and turn him into a nation as numerous as the stars in the sky. I think that gives us sufficient warrant to trust he can also take care of this part of the promise too, doesn't it? He could probably handle it. And along with God's faithful record, actually, we also have direct evidence from God that this detour to Egypt is not a mistake. It's not a mistake. If you like, turn with me to Genesis chapter 15, which will be on page 10 in your pew Bible if you're using that. I'll just read it for you as well. Listen to what God says to Abram in the context of promising him this land that he's going to give him. Genesis chapter 15, beginning at verse 12. Here we read, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here. But for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So, strange as it might seem to us, just jumping into Exodus here, why would God take them out of the land and bring them to Egypt? God tells his people here through Abraham explicitly. He's saying this 400-year trip to Egypt is not an error. It's not a mistake. This is exactly how I plan to deliver the land to you. The implication of God's plan is that you, the people of Israel, you're not the only people that I'm dealing with. As the sovereign Lord of the universe, I'm sovereign over all nations. And in 400 years' time, you will actually come back and be my chosen instrument of judgment and of punishment against the Amorites. And that's how I'm going to give you this land that I've promised to give you. Are you starting to get a clearer picture now of what I said? That that God is faithful to keep his promises, but he's not limited at all in any way by our presumptions, our presuppositions, our imagination. He's going to be faithful in his own time and in his own ways. And because he's God, it's always going to be perfect. His timing and ways will always be perfect. Okay? In other words, you could just say when God is fulfilling his promises and his plans, he doesn't have a suggestion box. What's strange to me even more is that everyone's headed down to Egypt seemingly in this great mood. God has provided for us. They seem to have forgotten what God explicitly said. Hey, you're going to be 400 years mistreated and enslaved in this place. Everyone's packing up and headed down like they're on a great trip. Like you would think that would be something you would write down and share with people. Hey, you should know if you ever get called down to Egypt, it's going to be bad. They just seem to be going without knowing that at all. I mean, the first 7 verses of Exodus, I almost read it's like the first 45 minutes of the movie Titanic. Everything seems happy, but we know how those stories end. And so, even though they're packed up and they're happy and they're whining and dining, maybe there's a couple standing on the front of a camel. I'm flying, Jack. I'm flying. I don't know. So why would they, if they do know, why are they going if they know this is happening? Is it just obedience? Well, God says specifically to Jacob in Genesis 46, don't be afraid to go down with your sons to live with Joseph. He tells him, I want you to do this. So, yeah, in part it's obedience. Is it just necessity? I mean, there's this famine going on. They're about to starve if this famine continues, and it will. So they need to go somewhere. They need to do something. So yes, in part we could say it's necessity. The other thing to say is this is God's will and plan. So he's working out his will. So that's also why they go. But the point I want us to see is that as we look at this story from a bird's eye view, looking down, knowing already God will be faithful to his people. He will be faithful to protect them as they're there and bring them safely out of Pharaoh's hand. He will be faithful to give them the land that he's giving them. What I want us to see really clearly is so that we can know that God is in absolute sovereign control, listen, even in the midst of circumstances that will appear totally out of control. He's in total control here, even though it's going to look like it's not in control at all. And that too ought to give us a great deal of hope when we're in the midst of circumstances that feel scary and out of control for us today. That even in what appears to be God's hurtling his people towards a cliff, and he's the one sending them there, God has not stepped off his throne. God is not pacing the halls of heaven, wringing his hands, calling the Holy Spirit and Jesus, come on, huddle up. How are we going to fix this situation? He's not worried at all. I wrote something recently, a post on a blog called Far Away So Close, which really, I think, speaks directly to this whole issue of our need to understand God's sovereign control over all things, our need for a big, huge, sovereign, transcendent God in the midst of the difficulties of our lives. And that I believe that is actually far more comforting in those moments than having a God who is only near and close to us. Now, God is absolutely those things too. He is the God who sticks closer than a brother. He's all those things. But don't you see that a God who is sovereignly ruling over everything in the universe is infinitely more comforting and stabilizing than if he were just putting an arm around you? Than if he were just holding your hand in a hospital bed? Because an infinite transcendent God doesn't just care about your suffering. He can actually do something about it. It's the difference between a friend, a fellow hostage sitting beside you in a prison, putting their arm around you, holding your hand and comforting you. It's the difference between that and a duded up, camoed out, fully loaded Navy SEAL kicking in the door of your cell, also taking your hand and saying, hey, you ready to get out of here? Both of those things are comforting. One of them can actually do something about the circumstances you're in. The message of the Bible is that God is both. He's both those things. But again, we always need to come back to, again and again and again, his timing, his ways. God says clearly in Isaiah 55, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts. That's a God who loves to come near, who loves to comfort, but is also completely other from us. But I'll tell you what, that can also be really hard to hear sometimes, can't it? How big and in control God is, particularly if you're going through a really difficult time in your life, and it's going on for a long time. It doesn't seem to be getting any better. Because if we're honest, I know we're in church right now, but if we're being honest with each other, maybe you'd never say it out loud, but there's a lot of times where we feel like God's doing a pretty crummy job, and his ways stink. Where we feel like, you know what, I would be doing a much better job than God's doing right now if I were God. Don't we do that? Don't we feel that way? I do. I feel that way all the time whenever things don't go the way that I was expecting them to and life gets hard, until I realize the absolute absurdity of that thought. But I feel that way all the time. Why are you doing it that way? But I've said before, I love how one pastor has said, if God is truly God, if we're really saying he is the God that the Bible describes, then he has to be big enough and great enough to do things sometimes that we're not going to understand. If we could understand everything he was doing, then wouldn't that make us God? But I think the key to all of this is that we need to have decided in our hearts and in our minds before the storm comes what we believe about God's sovereign control and what we believe about his goodness. We need to know before the storm comes what we believe about those things. Because I'll tell you what, it's no good waiting for the flood to come and then checking to see, is my life really rooted in the foundation of Christ and the gospel? It's too late then. The voices screaming in your ear, the panic that you're experiencing, is too overwhelming at that moment to think then. We need to decide beforehand, I will trust in God's goodness. I will trust that he's in control no matter what comes. Just like when you get married, you make a commitment and a covenant with your wife. Hey, I'm in no matter what. In sickness and in health, whatever comes, I'm here. I'm with you. In the same way, we need to decide before the storms come, I'm going to trust you, God. I'm going to trust that you are good, that you know what you're doing, even when it doesn't look like it to me. I promise you, I've experienced in my own life, that will be an anchor to you in the midst of the storm if you've decided ahead of time to trust him. I don't know about you, but a big question that I had to wrestle with as I studied this passage this week is, why would God allow his people to move to a place where he knew they were going to be oppressed, where he knew they were going to be enslaved? Why would he do that? Some go so far as to say, if God is truly in control and he would do that, then he's not loving. Or if he wanted to help them but he couldn't, then he's not really in control. Well, I don't think I'm going to be able to solve what is classically being called the problem of evil in the next 5 minutes. I won't. I would love to honestly sit with any of you sometime over a coffee and talk through some of your own individual circumstances and flesh out how that might work in God's sovereign plan. But I think we also need to admit, if God truly is this sovereign big God, then there's always going to be an element of mystery in this life. There's going to be things that we're not going to understand, answers that we won't have. But as we think about this God who has been faithful and who will continue to be faithful to his people, there's two things I'd like to offer to you in closing that I would like you to consider and that I've had to apply in my own life in various times. Firstly is this: if God truly is, as I think we've seen, more concerned about the process and what we learn and how we grow along the way than he is just about getting us to the end, doesn't it also follow that God could in fact be less concerned with our rescue than he is with our refinement? less concerned with our rescue than he is with our refinement. And the reason for that is because the rescue, he's not worried about that anymore. That's already taken care of. He knows it's going to happen. In Jesus, our ultimate rescue is already secure. Positionally, we already have inherited God's promised rest. So couldn't it be that our present sufferings, our trials in this life are all about God's refinement of us, teaching us to cling all the more tightly to his hand and to conform us more and more into the image of his Son? The other thing I want to offer you to consider is, for the Israelites, maybe another reason God allowed them to go to a place where he knew that they would be oppressed and enslaved is because he didn't want them to set up shop there. Egypt was not their final destination, and he wanted them to be ready to go when he called them out. And the same is no different for you and I today. Maybe consider a part of the struggles and the sufferings that God allows into our lives are also a reminder not to get too comfortable here. That this place is not our home. That he has a home far, far better beyond anything we can imagine here, prepared for us. And yet in our everyday conversation, don't we say things like, oh, I know that one day I will look on the face of Jesus and I'll be in heaven with him, but I sure would like to get married first. I know that everything in heaven will be beyond anything I could imagine. But man, I have got to see that. I got to travel to that bucket list destination before I go. And it just shows that we haven't yet understood what it is that God has prepared for us when we say things like that. Now, that doesn't mean those things are wrong to want. Yes, this world that God has made is amazing. Yes, those relationships are dear to us. Absolutely. But this is not our home. And everything that we call mine in this life could be taken from us in a second. And the aches and pains of life, I believe in part, are meant to be a constant reminder of that. Don't get comfortable here. We serve a God who has been faithful to us and who will continue to be faithful to us. Never forget, though, that his faithfulness doesn't have to look like what you thought it would for it still to be faithfulness. His perfect plan may look very different than what you imagine. The easiest place to see that is Jesus' followers looking up at the man they believed was the Messiah hanging naked on a cross. There's no way they could have imagined that what looked like a failure was actually God's victory. I'm going to ask you again to think about your own lives again. The way that God has been faithful to you up until now, and the events and circumstances that have brought you here to this morning. What are those things that came to your mind when we first talked about God's specific areas of faithfulness to you? As you think about that, some of us in here this morning need to repent. Some of us need to repent because we have wrongly accused God of being unfair and unjust, when all that he's truly guilty of is not being faithful to his promises in the way that we thought he should be. Some of us need to remind ourselves again of those instances, those consistent instances of faithfulness to us in the past. That's where we need to spend time and really cling to those things. That's where I've been living lately. As I wait on God to know the future of my family and myself here at Dunbar, and I fret and worry and stress about that. I need to constantly go back and remind myself, God has been faithful to me and my family all through our lives. And he can do it again. What am I so worried about? For some of us, as we think about where we are today, we know that the comforts and pleasures of this life have weakened our desire and longing for life with Christ to come. And we need to reorient our souls back to the truth that's hidden beneath the glitter and the facade of this world. And then, whatever that thing is that you're facing today that's causing you to fear and doubt again, whatever is stressing you out, whatever is pushing that panic button, along with me this morning, I'd ask you, would you lay it down? Would you lay it down before a transcendent, sovereign, and yet also loving and deeply intimate God and just leave it there? Trusting that He knows better. And trusting that His refining of you is just as important to Him as His rescue of you. I pray that that same perspective could be ours as well. Let's pray. I need help to do that. Let's pray for all of us.